let's have Kade on stage.
Good morning.
I can probably, hey, so I can give a bit of an introduction about Kade. Um, Kade is the director of the Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts. Recently, their work has expanded to include open data projects that aim to harness the power of digital technologies to reform the criminal legal system in Massachusetts. The ACLU of Massachusetts works to advance civil rights and civil liberties through public education, litigation, and legislative reforms. The Data for Justice project harnesses data science to advance key ACLU priorities. During this talk, Kate will discuss various data for justice projects and the law reform victories they've helped to secure for Massachusetts residents. Please welcome Kate to the stage.
Hi, thank you so much. Okay, let me just sharing my screen. Okay. It's a little awkward because you can see yourselves. Okay, so my name is Kade, and I run something at the ACLU of Massachusetts called the Technology for Liberty program. And within that, we have a project that we created a few years ago called the Data for Justice project. First, let me tell you a little bit about the ACLU. The ACLU of Massachusetts is the ACLU generally is the nation's oldest civil rights and civil liberties organization. Here in Massachusetts, our affiliate was founded in 1920, so we're more than 100 years old. For over 100 years, we have worked on a range of issues from abortion and gay rights, and now we do trans rights work as well, to police and surveillance reform, to free speech and censorship. We work on those issues and many others. Sometimes we like to call ourselves Freedom's Law Firm. And for a long time, most of the people who worked in the organization were lawyers, but that's not so true anymore. Now we're bringing technologists on board, data scientists, and we also have organizers and communications professionals, folks who work in communities across the state. So how do we do our work? We work in the legislature. We're lobbyists. I'm a lobbyist. I'm a registered lobbyist in the state of Massachusetts. So that means I basically try to convince state lawmakers to pass laws that advance civil rights and civil liberties. We work in the courts, obviously. I think that's what most people are familiar with respect to our work. So we have a lot of lawyers who file lawsuits to try to advance civil rights and civil liberties through the courts. And then we also work in city and town governments throughout Massachusetts and at the executive level, trying to promote policy that will advance civil rights and civil liberties. So a few years ago, we founded the Data for Justice project, which aims to use data science to advance our law reform goals in various areas. So I'm going to talk today about some of that work, and then I hope we can get into a conversation and I can answer any questions you all have. So litigation. This is when we have used data science in court. So this happened most recently when the COVID-19 pandemic struck. You're probably aware that prisons and jails are often very cramped places where there's not a lot of hygienic, where hygiene is not great, and people don't have great access to the kinds of basic technologies like masks that they need to stay safe during the COVID pandemic. So as soon as the pandemic was declared, in March of 2020, everyone in my office started working from home, and the litigators, the lawyers in my office, realized we have to do something to try to get people out of prison and jail in Massachusetts, because we don't want to, in 6 months, turn around and realize that we have basically, as a society, let a lot of people needlessly die in prison and jail, because prisons and jails are essentially like perfect environments for the rapid and uncontrolled spread of a virus like COVID-19. So we filed a lawsuit and asked the state's high court, the Supreme Judicial Court, the SJC, that's like the Supreme Court for the state of Massachusetts, to order released classes of incarcerated people in Massachusetts. We thought, people who don't have very much time left on their sentence, people who are older or have complications, comorbidities that might make it more likely that if they were to contract COVID-19, they would get sick and die. Unfortunately, the court did not agree with us. And so they did not order the kind of mass release of incarcerated people that we were asking for. But what they did was force the prisons and jails to start producing information about how COVID was spreading in their facilities every day. And so with this information, the data scientist who worked with us at that time, her name is Lauren Chambers. She's now gone on to get a PhD at the Information School at Berkeley. Worked with our litigation department to build this tool that's available on the website that I'll share with you at the end of this talk, that allowed anyone, reporters, other folks in the media, but most importantly, defense lawyers, to see on a daily basis what COVID looked like in each facility, in each prison and jail across Massachusetts. Because the data that the prisons and jails were sending us was coming, in a spreadsheet essentially every day to the court from a prison or a jail, and there are, a dozen or so of them statewide. And so that wasn't really helpful. It wasn't really in a helpful format for folks. So what Lauren did is that she built a tool that she could put that data inside to make it visual so that people could track, from one day to the next, month to month. As you see here, the incarcerated population over time at a facility. You could compare how many people were tested in a facility and how many positive cases there were. You could look at deaths in these facilities, and more. So that tool was used by public defenders and defense attorneys across the state who were trying to make arguments to get their own clients released during the pandemic. So it was a really, really helpful tool. And we don't know how many people were released from incarceration because of Lauren's work on this tool, but I'm guessing that the number is significantly more than one. The second example of data science that we've done in concert with litigation has to do with a massive drug lab scandal that unfolded in Massachusetts over a period of a decade. So I'm not going to get into the whole backstory of the drug lab scandal. There's a movie on Netflix, actually, that you can watch. I think it's a short series, documentary series about the drug lab scandal in Massachusetts. I can put a link in the chat later if you're interested in watching that. But suffice it to say, there were chemists, this one chemist in particular, Annie Ducan, who was committing misconduct in a state drug lab, and essentially not testing drug samples in criminal drug prosecution cases that she said she was testing. And so potentially thousands of people were wrongfully convicted based on information, promises essentially that she made to the court about having tested drug samples when she really didn't. And so this was discovered about 10 years into her misconduct. And the government in Massachusetts took the approach that all of the people who were subjected to wrongful conviction because of Annie Ducan's misconduct, it was up to them to come back to the court and say, hey, I think I might have been wrongfully convicted based on this fraud, essentially. And we thought, that's not right. The legal director in my office, Matt Siegel, is a kind of visionary. And he thought, that doesn't sound right. I think we should ask the state, the court, to dismiss all of these cases. Any case that was touched by this misconduct should just be dismissed. You shouldn't require people, many of whom are low income, formerly incarcerated people who may not even know that their case is one of these cases. You shouldn't, put the burden on them when it was the state's fault. So the litigation lasted a very long time. Initially, this was the high court, the Supreme Judicial Court. Initially, the SJC was not did not look upon our request favorably. They were not interested in dismissing all of these cases at once. But what they did was, again, provide us with data. So they told us, here are the cases. Here's the universe of cases that we think, because of the time period in question, could have been tainted by Annie Ducan's misconduct. And so with that information, we were able to do some very simple data science that showed, among other things, that 62% of those cases were for simple drug possession. Now, that really told a different story than the one that the prosecutors were telling when they were in court saying, you can't dismiss all of these cases, you can't dismiss all of these cases. They were telling the press and the courts that these are very serious criminals, these were people who were drug trafficking and, harming our communities. And it would be a really, really dangerous thing if the court were to dismiss all these cases. Well, it turned out that wasn't remotely true. The vast majority of these cases were simple possession. And so when we were able to show the court that kind of changed the whole tenor of the case. And the court became much more open to doing what it ultimately did, which was to order huge numbers of dismissals. So I think at the end of the litigation, something like 25,000 criminal cases were vacated, or convictions were vacated, which is the largest number, not just in Massachusetts history, but we think in the history of the world. The final example I'll give on litigation has to do with a 2016 Supreme Judicial Court, again, high court decision from Massachusetts that held that Black men may have legitimate fear to run from the Boston Police Department. And this was a decision that explicitly cited as justification for that ruling a report published by the ACLU of Massachusetts a few years prior about Boston Police Department stop and frisk data. So we analyzed data from the Boston Police Department that showed that Black people were stopped at far higher rates than they represent in the population in the city of Boston. Something like 65% of the stops were of Black people, whereas only 24% of the population of Boston is Black. And we were able to demonstrate that disparity remained consistent, even if you accounted for crime rates in a community, because the police would always say, well, we know who's doing the crime and we know where the crime is, and that's where we go, and it's not about race. Our report was explicitly cited in this landmark SJC decision that said, because of racial disparities, because of the Boston Police Department's likelihood of stopping Black men at rates that far surpass their population rate, it is actually reasonable for a Black man to run from a Boston police officer, and that does not mean that he's doing anything wrong. So that was quite remarkable as well. Okay, so the other area of our work where we bring in data science is in legislative advocacy. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of that. So just this past September, we had a pretty important municipal election in Boston, the mayoral preliminary election. And at around the same time, the ACLU of Massachusetts and many other organizations in Massachusetts were trying to push the Massachusetts state legislature to adopt voting rights reform. And among those reforms, we wanted same-day voter registration or election day voter registration. So that would mean that, you can show up on election day. If you're not registered, it doesn't matter. You can just register right there and then vote the same day. Now, one of the arguments that we used to advocate for election day registration was discovered right here by our data scientist. Using data from the September 14th preliminary election in Boston, we were able to show that wards in the city of Boston that have high percentage of proportions of renters, people who rent instead of own their own home, we're also likely to have very low turnout compared to neighborhoods where more people own their homes, which had much higher rates of turnout. And you can see it's almost a line. I mean, it's almost a perfect predictor. And what does this mean? Well, you live in the city of Boston, maybe, or you've been aware of what's going on out here in terms of real estate. The whole city basically turns over on September 1st because there are so many students here, and so a ton of people move right before the election. This year, in fact, our primary election is falling on September 6th. That's when you'll be able to vote in the primary for governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and a number of other important races. And what's the problem here is that in Massachusetts, there's a voter cutoff deadline. So I forget exactly what the deadline is, but it's something like 2 weeks. You cannot register to vote unless you do it 2 weeks before the election. I believe it's 2 weeks. And what this shows is that cutoff date, the fact that we don't have same-day voter registration, disenfranchises particularly renters. So what does that mean? It disenfranchises young people. It disenfranchises lower income people. It disenfranchises young professionals, people who are new to the community. And so we used this to try to advocate for same day, or rather election day voter registration. Because think of it this way, even if you live in Boston, say you live in East Boston, and then you're moving on, September 1st, like half the other city, to Mattapan, that's like a 2.5-hour ride on a bus or on public transportation. You're likely not going to want to go back to your old neighborhood to vote come election day. And that's the only way that you would be able to vote unless we have same-day voter registration. So again, I thought this was a really cool project. It illustrated how the fact that we don't have same-day voter registration harms certain populations. The next example is a tool that we built a couple of summers ago when the whole state was talking about police reform. We were among a lot of organizations fighting for strong police reform legislation at the Massachusetts state legislature. And one of the things that the police were saying to sort of, combat our efforts was, look, police in Massachusetts are not like police elsewhere. You don't have to paint us with a broad brush. We're not like the police in Minneapolis. We're not like the police in New York. We treat people with respect here. You don't need to pass police reform. And we thought, okay, that's an interesting perspective. So let's see if it's true. And we did a bunch of research, and we found it's not remotely true, that there have been countless examples of police misconduct, violence, shootings, corruption, fraud in Massachusetts law enforcement. And so we put together this mapping tool on the Data for Justice website that allowed people to explore some of those incidents, submit an incident. So there's like a crowdsourcing function to this website. And then crucially, to take action. So you could click that take action button and send an email to your lawmakers and say, I support strong police reform legislation. So this project got some media attention, and we thought it was pretty successful. And we did end up passing pretty good police reform legislation. So the final projects I'll show you are kind of just like a mishmash of other efforts that we've engaged in. This tool most recently was published a couple months ago on our website. This allows people to see whether the police department in their community has a drone. And then if so, we have a tab that allows people to access information that they need to file a public records request with that government agency to learn how the drones are being used. This is a tool that's been on the website for a long time. This allows people to analyze Boston Police Department data to sort of make policing visible. So you can compare different incidents over time. You can look at the rate of what we've determined are major incidents compared to minor incidents. You can look at the locations of these incidents. And this has been a really helpful tool for me because every once in a while I can just sort of check, like what are the crime rates look like in the city of Boston? And just so you know, they're actually going down. This was another project that we did at the beginning of the pandemic. This was really surprising to me, actually. Obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation in Massachusetts and across the country about internet access. And in Massachusetts, at least on Beacon Hill at the legislature, the conversation about internet access for a long time has focused on rural broadband. And as you can see by looking at this map, we do have problems with access to rural broadband. In some parts of Western Massachusetts, 25%, 20% of the population does not have broadband access. But you'll also note that there are a couple of really bright yellow spots on this map in Springfield and Boston. Those are urban areas, right, where 30% or more of a community does not have broadband access. And that was new information to us, at least, because it indicated that in some communities, access is not an issue in the sense that, Verizon Fios doesn't come to your door. The problem is that you have Verizon Fios at your door, but you can't afford it. And that's what's happening in a lot of our communities and cities across the state. So that, I think, was really helpful information for policymakers who were thinking about, what to do about access in Massachusetts. Another example is during conversations over the past couple of summers about policing and how much money we're spending on police. Lauren Chambers, again, data scientist who was working for me at the time, did a lot of work examining the Boston Police Department's budget, their overtime spending. And crucially, I think this plot is maybe the most important one that she produced, because there have long been conversations about how much money the Boston Police Department spends on overtime. And every time the Boston Police would be hauled before the city council or asked about it in the press, they would say, well, the reason that overtime spending is so out of control is because we need to hire more police officers. We don't have enough police officers on payroll, and so we have to send people out to cover shifts and pay them overtime. Well, okay, we decided to look and see if that's actually true. And as you can see, there is no correlation actually between the number of Boston Police Department employees and overtime spending. So just with this one plot, we were able to demolish basically the central claim that the Boston Police Department has been making publicly for years about why overtime spending is so out of control. I think this is the final example. This is something I'm really proud of. Again, at the beginning of the pandemic, we thought maybe we should look to see whether there's a relationship between the areas where people are experiencing high rates of COVID and the areas where lots of people are doing essential jobs. So we found this chart. These maps show Chelsea, Massachusetts. We also found the same is true in Boston. That yes, there's a very large correlation significant correlation between the number of people, the percent of people who work in COVID essential positions, and the number of people who have COVID. This was really important because with this analysis, and this is just part of it, we were able to ask the governor we got some good press attention on this, and we were able to ask the governor to, I should just back up and say this was at a time when Chelsea was experiencing some of the highest rates of COVID in the state. So neither of these maps shows that, but that was kind of like everybody knew that at the time. And so we published these maps. We gave them to WBUR. They did some stories about it. And one of the things that we called for was for the governor to open up the emergency testing sites. Because you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, you couldn't get a test. There was no testing available. You couldn't get a PCR test from your doctor. You couldn't, these rapid tests didn't exist. And so the governor opened up emergency testing facilities, but only initially to first responders, to police officers, firefighters, and EMTs. And we looked at these maps and we thought, wait a second, why are grocery store workers, truck drivers, and other people who work in essential positions being left out of those testing facilities? They're going to work every day too. They need to be able to access this important resource from the state. And so we published this information. We called on the governor to open those testing sites to all essential workers. And pretty quickly he did, within a couple of days. So we were really proud of that. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now. This is the website that you can go to check out all of these projects and many others. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was an eye-opening talk. So we have few questions. First is, what is it that inspired you to join the ACLU? And when is it in your career that you decided that you should join ACLU?
Well, I've been working for the ACLU for a long time, 13 years now. And I initially got started actually working very part-time on a contract basis, doing some research for the organization. And I just got really, really interested in the work. And, you know, as my boss now says, kind of just like refused to leave and like made a space for myself and kept asking people, you know, like, I feel like we should be doing this, and I have an idea about this project, and, you know, what if we took this on? And so eventually she just thought, well, I guess I need to give you a job because you're not going anywhere, and you keep proposing work. So yeah, you know, it's kind of like an unusual story of how I got to where I am.
All right. Also, like the participants would like to know, what is it that, what are the ways in which probably the people who are working in some other job or are studying right now can get in touch with ACLU to contribute to some similar projects?
Great question. So every spring, fall, and spring and fall semester, and then in the summer, I hire an intern, and frequently that person is someone who works on some of these data projects. So that's one way. Another is you can do volunteer work. You know, if you're interested in getting involved with some of the kinds of projects that I've just showed you. We've got a lot of similar projects that we're working on right now. And we do have volunteers that help us, whether it's with like cleaning data sets or, you know, writing scripts to pull data out of PDFs and things like that. So, you know, if you're interested, you feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to talk to you about volunteer opportunities.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. I think we will see you anyway during the networking session. And yeah, then participants can probably reach out to you then.
Actually, unfortunately, I'm not going to be there this afternoon. I have a meeting that I have
Oh,
to,
okay.
but people should feel free to email me. I'll respond.
All right. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay. Thank you so much, Kate. It was really nice to hear from you.
You're welcome.
And yeah, we will move on to our next talk in maybe another 5 minutes. So probably you can grab some water, and we'll be back in 5 minutes.